Okay. Well, as you were reading, hopefully you were reading the right chapter, and we are discussing the 12 ordinary men, Matthew and Thomas. So my very first question to you is really, what did you like? Anything that stood out to you?
I'll go first.
Okay.
There's a couple. I'm going to start with Thomas. It wasn't anything that I've ever known about Thomas. It was always just doubting Thomas. It's doubting Thomas. And all of a sudden it's like, well, there was a reason why he was the way he was. Is he, not that he was doubting, he just needed to know the facts. Only the facts. So that changed my whole thinking on him. And then in Matthew, I have a question about him too also. It was interesting, he was a tax collector, and it talked about how that was the scourge, and they were the worst of the worst of the worst of the worst. And that leads to my question, but I'll ask that in a little bit. But it was interesting, on page 150, they were talking about the religious leaders that were mad at Jesus, but they weren't mad because of all the miracles and stuff. They were mad because he called them sinners. And it was like, how could they? But I kept thinking, well, everybody's a sinner. How can you not think that you're not a sinner?
Yeah.
That's how much above everybody they thought they were. So, that's kind of crazy. In my mind, that was crazy. But my question about Matthew is, he was collecting the taxes, whether it was city tax or whatever it was that he was collecting, but he also would collect money for himself. That was just a practice that they did.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they get away with that? How could they get away with that? Or was it an accepted practice and we just hated you for it? But that just seemed silly to me.
So, yeah, it was more of an accepted practice, because, how shall I put this? It was very similar to the way that they would take a little extra as their fee for themselves, but also even more so. That they would take, like, say the tax was 10%, then they would actually take more like 15%. Some of it they would use to have their own luxurious lifestyle in the city, and another portion of it would be, I'll say, an emergency fund or cushion, that if Rome ever came to them and said, yeah, you don't have enough here, then they would go to that fund in order to cover the cost, because if they did not cover the taxes, they would no longer be the tax man.
So it was more of a CYA.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay. Well, that makes more sense to me. I was like, well, how did the people let them get away with that? Or did the people even know?
Oh, the people knew all too well. And it was also, too, that they would actually take that extra as a means of covering themselves so that others who couldn't pay their taxes at the time, they would then cover those taxes. And so in the end, it worked itself out, but always who was in ahead? The tax man.
Right.
So.
Okay.
So tailing off of that, did they get a salary?
Not a salary like we would think of. It would be more of the percentage of the taxes that they were able to take.
So they set their own. They weren't given like a salary and then they were taking this as a bonus.
Correct. But it's kind of like a person who's working on commission, and everyone has to get your product. Well, hey, you're going to get a pretty dang good commission.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, well, Eric is back, so I am going to turn it back over to you. All I merely asked was, what did you like?
Yeah, I figured. That's the first question.
And I'm going to actually stop presenting and let you take over so that way you can control your slides.
Okay. There we go. So, kind of the same question. I don't know how many people got to answer. What was your first thoughts of this chapter?
Well, I am finding that the less that they tell us that they know about the apostles, this is amazing to me, but it's going to sound so silly to you. The more questions I have, specifically with Matthew, I never thought about it. Why did he become a tax collector when he was Jewish and the Jews hated it?
Mm-hmm.
And my thought of how Martin Luther wanted to bring the word to the people, and everything I hear in time prior to that, the word was extremely rare in a printed form.
Mm-hmm.
And if he was such a scholar, where did he get his scriptures, the Old Testament, to study so much?
Yeah, that's great questions. And I don't know have the answer for you on that one.
I tell it, right?
And the one thing that, like, you asking or saying that you have more questions than answer, or that's what this book, for me, the first time I read it, did was start making me ask questions. And kind of like what we talked about last year, being aware of just taking stuff at face value, of what other people say, finding my own journey and starting asking those questions, and then going back to the Bible and going back to history and finding those things. So I think the first step is to ask the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and for me, it's not really, how did he get the information? It's the fact that he took the extra steps to get the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does show how hungry he was for the religion that was rejecting him outright.
Well, and it's shown time and time again here when we talk about the different apostles, how hungry they were, and how, hunger is not the right word, but how ready to have the Messiah in their life or have them around the Messiah. It was just like, Thomas immediately said, yeah, this is where I need to be. I don't want to sound like I'm dissing Thomas, but almost like somebody that loves or follows or believes in something so much is almost like a groupie when I read that he didn't know how to live without him, meaning the death.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't embrace the fact that he could live with him spiritually, at least at the point that I read that. Yet I'm guilty of that. I find people, let's just say a charismatic, you get this certain sense coming from them, and it almost becomes a hunger, and you want to have them around. That's a good thing until it's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we know this is a good thing because it's Christ. But the presentation just kind of led me down that path like, wow. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that one because you just made me think about this of, we've grown up with this story. And we knew the ending of the story just as much as we knew the beginning of the story. When they were living through it, when he left and died, even though he told them that he was coming back, that was like, whoa, like that can't happen. I always think about, that kind of atmosphere is going and thinking about where they were in those shoes. And Thomas, I think in this book he elaborates or comes up with a lot of stuff on Thomas, but I like Matthew in this book a lot better. I can see where he stands on it though. Of like all of a sudden he's gone, and what am I supposed to do? The person that I gave my life to follow is now all of a sudden gone, and I don't know where to go. And everybody's telling me to believe, and I'm like, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be a hard, without knowing that part, the other part of it. Would I believe? Would I be like Thomas in that situation? And I think I would.
Mm-hmm.
I would doubt myself. Anybody else?
Yeah, I kind of like the way that they kind of expressed Thomas as being Eeyore and Winnie the Pooh, because everything was terrible and woe was me. I just thought that was kind of neat because it was more, instead of just I won't know that he's alive until I touch his hand inside. It was more like, wow, this is just the worst thing that could have happened. I don't know what to do about this. And he couldn't get out of that little sad spot until finally he was able to. But I thought that was an interesting little just explanation of him. And also I thought it was interesting because when we were looking at to buy that church over by Kent Elementary, it ended up being a Mar Thoma church, which is an Indian Christian church, which I didn't know existed until that point. And that was because it's based on St. Thomas, and their church started there. And I thought that was a very fascinating thing to find out after years of never hearing about that before.
Sure.
So that's just interesting to me. So I think the part that made me interested was the fact that he invited all his friends who were just as kind of scumbags as he was. And he was not the top of even though he had a nice house because of all the money he skimmed, all of his friends were like that too. So when he invited them, he wanted them to see what was better. He must have had that so far inside of himself that he wanted something better. He didn't know what it was until he met Jesus. But I just thought that was really interesting to invite all those, crummy friends of his that were the same boat as him, but he was not looking for trying to get somebody better than him or a Pharisee over. He was just inviting his buddies, and that's such a neat way to do it. I think that's what we all try to do in the long run.
Well, I was just thinking, I really like that Jesus would pick somebody like Thomas, because there always has to be this person who questions things in order to relate to 90%, 95% of the people who are going to be reading the story. What would the story be like if we didn't have somebody like Thomas who's questioning it?
Actually, for the beginning, I want to start at the end, the very last paragraph of the chapter. The disciples acknowledged their own sinfulness and looked to Christ for grace. He met them with grace, mercy, and forgiveness, and transformed their lives that would glorify him. He does that for all who truly trust him. And that was what stood out to me. I thought that was just a very appropriate ending for maybe the book itself.
Mm-hmm.
It was hopeful.
And following up on that, what Cheryl says, I highlighted that entire thing that she just said, but then I circled except Judas, which I thought was really interesting because right at the very beginning it says all 12, with the exception of Judas Iscariot, were from Galilee. And it makes me, I have not read ahead, but it makes me want to go read chapter 10 right now to figure out, okay, what's up with this Judas Iscariot? Because it's interesting that, they were all from Galilee and Jesus chose them, and then at the very end, all except him. And of course, we all know what he did, so it's interesting.
Anybody else?
I guess I've always thought it interesting that poor Thomas gets labeled as doubting Thomas. I mean, you want to be called smart Susie and dumb Jerry or whatever it is. It was just an adjective that we used to describe him, but it wasn't, in my opinion, so much that he was asked to believe Jesus when he said he would come back. These were his friends. They'd all seen it except him. And that to me is just simply human nature. If you see something so wonderful and so miraculous that it is really unbelievable to anyone else, the normal reaction would be, I can't wrap my head around this. I have to see this for myself. I've seen it in medicine when somebody's results come back really good and nobody expects it. It's like, I have to see this. Let me pull, everybody's like, I have to see this record. I want to see those films. I want to see what it says. And it's human nature. Yet we lay it off on him. It's like, well, why didn't you believe? Well, I don't see that the first guys who heard from the women at the tomb were all that thrilled about believing either. So, we don't say doubting Peter. But anyway, so I guess I just find it interesting that as humans we lay that off on him because it's kind of the way we've been taught. Oh, that's doubting Thomas. And, and I feel like he was much more normal. Maybe because I am more like a hard facts person. I am that person. I want to see it. You tell me something, I want to see it right away. And that's his personality. I think it's interesting that Christ chose a lot of the people that wanted to see it first, because those people then had to go out and tell a world who were never going to see him, right? Once he ascended again, that group wasn't going to see him again, and they probably had the best perspective of explaining to someone else what it meant because they'd been there. They'd walked through it. They knew what it was like to not believe what they couldn't see. And I think they may have had a better job of conveying that to other people.
Yeah.
Well, and for me, from the beginning, I kind of told y'all this author likes to take 2 or 3 sentences or 2 or 3 moments in the Bible and run with it. It was actually doubting Thomas that made me realize I had done that for him. Because I grew up in, only really hearing about doubting Thomas, not his other 2 moments. And it was then rereading it later that I realized the author was doing the same. And so this read through, I'm now going, how much more am I learning, knowing kind of everything I've learned since? And still agreeing with the personalities and the fact that God did choose multiple personalities and that every personality can be used to further the kingdom and for his purpose, but that's the thing that always kind of stood out for me on this chapter. It's how much more could we learn by really reading through the Bible and not just taking the incidents each time.
And if you think about it, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Cheryl. Finish.
It just made me think. And please don't admit to anything because I'm not going to either. How many of us grew up with odd nicknames from childhood, or something that our friends called us? Okay, Eric, I don't know what it was. I'll ask Kayla. But no, not. I don't mean like in a mean way because I'm not talking about that. But grew up with some silly name because of the one stupid thing we did in front of everybody. Right? It was just. Or you said something that was just odd and that stuck with you, and it's just what you said, Scott. We've taken one little moment in time and we said, ha, this is you forever. So I think it's human nature, not necessarily good, but I think it is human nature to do that.
So a couple of things that stood out to me. Actually, Judy said it right off the bat when she was talking about that what the religious leaders really didn't like is the fact that he pointed out they were sinners. That just struck me right at the beginning. It's like, well, you thought you were better than everybody else, but that really struck me. I have to say, with Matthew, I really was struck by, and I knew this, but this book just points these out to me and makes me really reflect on things. I knew that Matthew, the book of Matthew, which may be the book that we know the best, and people know Matthew, had so much. It was talking about how much Old Testament it had in there to kind of prove the point. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, he was hated by the Jews. I mean, we know he was Jewish, but obviously he knew his religion, and he used that to be able to draw Jews into Jesus. Mm-hmm. I think I have to also say, for those of us who watched The Chosen together and talked about them, now that I've read this book and I read this, I don't like the way they portrayed him at all. I don't like it. So now I don't like that so much. As far as doubting Thomas, just like Cheryl said, I mean, poor person did this one thing and then now he's remembered in history. But there was a chapter on him, or a verse, that I really liked, because Jesus was talking about going to Lazarus and he was going to go bring him back. And they didn't want him to go because they knew he was walking into possibly being killed. I mean, people were hunting him. And then it said on page 160, it said, then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, then let us also go that we may die with him. Mm-hmm. Meaning dying with Jesus. And in the next paragraph, he says, while he is pessimistic that he's going to die with Jesus, he's heroic pessimism. That he believes in Jesus and he'll be standing right there with him. That really struck me. That he was, even being pessimistic about it, he was willing to go.
When you actually pointed out something that I had a question on, or would have asked the question, I guess I'm going to. Knowing that Matthew was rejected by the Jewish people and hated, was anyone else kind of shocked to find out that he wrote his gospel for the Jews?
I guess I didn't think of it that way. It's a good point.
Yeah, the man that was scorned from Jewish people for so long, he was the one that actually, put his hand out to them and said, no, let's come together. And I think Scott makes a great point on that, for that question. That was something that I always thought about too, that's why I moved it to the new slide to kind of remind everybody that, that he was hated completely. He wasn't allowed into the synagogue. He did write Matthew, which the theme in Matthew was forgiveness. So the man that got scorned constantly wrote more about forgiveness than anybody else. And kind of piggybacking on Scott's what are your feelings on that, of understanding that he was so hated and scorned, and that he reached out to those people?
I think that completely has to do with Kimball's question as to why he became a tax collector. I think that probably plays a big part in it. And without knowing that, it's hard to know otherwise.
Go for it, Pastor. Saw you unmute.
Yeah. For me, I have known that the gospel was written for the Jewish people, but that was also part of my studies. It was, I actually appreciated the way that they did the character Matthew in The Chosen for that reason, because it gave us some idea of a reason why he would have left the Jewish people and become a tax collector. He was probably already odd and rejected by many of the people for being odd, and so then he chose a profession where he could at least take care of himself and find another means of reaching out to others. I mean, he still had his heart, he still had compassion, but his focus was on the details. And when he did have his job, he probably had enough wealth that he could have hobbies, that he probably had a scribe or someone who he could then have come over and teach him the Hebrew, the Old Testament, all of those traditional things that maybe he could then be a part of still, even though he was no longer welcome, even though he was rejected. I think the gospel that he wrote for the Jewish people, I think, does highlight how the people may have hated him, but he did not hate them. And it's just kind of a testimony, I think, for him of what his character was, where his heart was. When we watched The Chosen, we saw that he would try and go back to his own home, and his mother would say, "If your father sees you here, that would just be awful." And yet he still wants to be a part of the people. He still wants to return home. I think that this kind of gives us it gave us a deeper insight. It may not have been historically accurate, but it does give us some means of the depth and the feeling in a different way.
So piggybacking on that, one of the things that I wrote on the last slide of Matthew was materialistic. Growing up in probably a very poor community, especially in the Jewish community, and looking at somebody that has things, I know that in all of our lives we would want more than what we have in our own means. That's what I actually took it as. He ran to go get that, and maybe regretted it afterwards, or as he grew, he grew closer to God more than his possessions. So I wrote down that he wanted possessions. Basically, the first thing that he wanted was possessions, and that's what my view was of why he chose to be a tax collector. Is for means.
I also saw that he was a very capable individual. He had certain technical skills that would not have been well used in most other jobs in the community. And if he's very introspective and looking at where he ought to fit into the community, it might make sense for him to choose a job that's highly technical, requires a very bright brain, and he was able to be good in it. I think in some ways the author was trying to make the point that because most of these apostles were from Galilee, from a rural area, that they were ordinary. But all that means was that they grew up in a rural area. Even in a rural area, you can have very bright people. You have a random distribution of all kinds of skills, and it's just that maybe they aren't utilized as well in some areas. And Jesus was able to spot that. I think he was able to pick out the people who had the faith, who had the ability to speak in front of thousands of people. That's not an ordinary person who can do that.
I mean, I always kind of took the rural what the author kind of tries to do is saying the difference between like Ivy League school trained and educated, doctorates, masters, versus community college farmers, fishermen, maybe just high school graduates. And yet it was the 12 disciples who went out and changed the entire world's view, including the most educated and influential people of that time.
So my next question on Matthew is, so Matthew hosted a party for Jesus, as we know. Why do you think that in Matthew, the book of Matthew, all he writes is that Jesus told him to called him to follow, and he followed, but it's actually in John that we find out that he threw a party afterwards? Why do you think that Matthew, in his own book, didn't write that down about himself?
Well, that I think would have been bragging, and he really didn't do that in that whole book. It seems if it's based on forgiveness, he's not going to brag about, oh, this is what I did, because I'm so great, I did this, I did that. There's even the story, I don't remember if that's in Matthew, about the tax collector that goes to the synagogue, and the priest is at the synagogue, and he's praying, and he's saying, I'm so glad I'm not a tax collector. The other guy just says, just have mercy on me, which I think is kind of what he was like, maybe, and he didn't want to brag and say, hey, I did this, I'm so cool.
It was in the book of Luke, actually.
Luke, okay, I wasn't sure where it was.
So I took it as he wasn't so much bragging, but he was so enamored and happy to be with Christ, to be called. And he wanted to share that with his friends. And to get his friends to see that, he invited them all together to meet Jesus. I didn't take it as, look at me, who I've got as my friend, but come meet this guy.
Yeah, well, that's what I did too. That's why he didn't write about it. Because if he had written about it in his own gospel, it would have been like, oh, look at this. This is what I did. But somebody else wrote about it because they found it to be so, I don't know, such a neat thing that he did, because he invited all those friends that were like him. Mm-hmm. They weren't all, in the top layer of the society and stuff.
I think a lot of it had to do with perspective. To Matthew, they were just his friends. Mm-hmm. Now, to Luke, he was able to see they were tax collectors and other people in questionable positions in the community.
Hmm. Well, I kind of wonder if maybe, it ended up creating a big stir among the religious elite, oh, look at who he's with, look at who, and of course he had just been called to Jesus. I wonder, how you do something and you think it's a great thing, and then afterwards you feel a little bit like, oh, look what I did. Mm-hmm. Everybody made a big deal about it. It created more rift. It made them dislike Jesus more. I don't know. I just wonder if maybe that was some of it, that he was maybe not, I don't know, maybe was a little regretful, even though we know that Jesus didn't regret that at all, and that was what he was there to do. I don't know. I just wondered if he felt bad about that party.
It gave Jesus the chance to tell the world that he had, if you, the doctor doesn't has to be there to cure the sick. Mm-hmm. He's not there for the healthy people.
Well, and I think also Matthew, because he wrote for the Jewish people, to remind the Jewish people at that point, reading this, of some of the most hated people that they know, and skip upon, or just skip that portion of it, could also be another reason for that. And I see Pastor Emily.
I get the announcement every time I unmute. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. Jim, I think you're right. And I think Cindy's also raising some good questions here to start thinking about. Part of this is Matthew's also writing something that the people themselves would recognize. They knew how the Pharisees were. They knew how the Sadducees were and how they didn't always get along. And yet everyone else felt like they were caught in the middle of their little tiff as to who's right in all of their argument. And now Jesus is coming along and saying, you're both wrong. What's really the point here is you need to be caring for the people that are among you. There's not someone who's lesser than. What God's point here is that you would be focused on God. You would be a community and a people as one people. And now you've divided yourselves. Why? I'm here for those that are willing to listen. Those who say, I am a sinner. I'm wanting God in my life. I'm here for them.
So my last question on Matthew is not necessarily one to answer, but one to think about for yourself, because I'm big on that. So in that story of the party where we hear Jesus talking to the Pharisees and the hierarchies of the Jews, do you ever see yourself being that person, being the hierarchies? Have we as individuals and as Christians acted in that way? Pastor raising his hand. And then the other one is, if we are in that role, who are our tax collectors? Who are our prostitutes in our own lives, of how we see our world? I think that's the other way that sometimes we have to think about it and go to Jesus in that way and be reflected into ourselves. So like I said, not going to make you answer it. So it's a tough one.
It also always reminds me of to Jews I became as a Jew, to the Gentiles I became as a Gentile. And it's that reaffirmation that, you know, Jesus sat with the tax collectors, and I'm sure he would have sat with the Pharisees and Sadducees if they would have listened. You know, but he came and he went out to anybody that would listen.
Very true. And before I switch the slide and we go to Thomas, excuse me. So his seal, or his symbols of Matthew, are bags of coins that aren't spilled, first and foremost, are not spilled. That goes back to the fact that he was a tax collector. And then a halberd, which is a giant axe with a long handle. And they say that is because of the way he died, but there's very mixed stories about how he died. Some say that he burned at the stake, some say that he got beheaded, hence why the axe. So we're not exactly sure how he passed or how he died. We just know that he was martyred. So that's where we are on Matthew. So Thomas, the twin, obviously known as Doubting Thomas, which we kind of covered my first question earlier of what's your feelings about that. But kind of going on that a little bit. So now hearing a little bit more about Doubting Thomas, or the twin, other thoughts about him do you guys have?
I might dare say he was the most devoted.
Which is weird that now he's called the Doubting Thomas, being, it's like the opposite. He got labeled the opposite of what he was. Anything else? Anybody?
I kind of would like to wonder if his twin was a part of the followers of Jesus. no way to ever know, but I just wonder.
You actually jumped onto my next question. Kind of going on that is, did you think the fact that he was a twin, a lot of times people don't mention, call somebody a twin unless you see the twins together. So that was going to be my next question is do you think Thomas's twin happened to be in the group, and why was he chosen and not his twin? Or any thoughts on that?
Well, I did notice in there somewhere that they said that it could have been a woman. He might have had a sister. And if it was a sister, it probably wasn't mentioned. That's kind of how I thought about it.
I was going to say it was a girl and she has a strong faith, but because of the times, they couldn't talk about her the way they talked about everybody else.
Yeah, I actually appreciated the fact that he noted that it could have been a woman, because I'll say it this way, some scholars will not even give the credit that it is a woman. It would just be that this was a lesser man, and so the stronger of the two twins is who Jesus kind of selected. I was interested too to note that MacArthur actually called Thomas a pessimist. When we don't really have much in the way of his personality or of his writings or anything like that. I liked his idea of him being the Eeyore of Winnie the Pooh. I guess more for me, I was curious as to where he was getting some of that idea, some of that perspective. If he was pulling it from some historians that he had read. Yeah, I guess I was just more curious on some of that.
Is there anything written through the Mar Thoma or the Indian Christian Church about him? Do they have anything besides the fact that he supposedly started? He was the bringer of the gospel there, because there's still a church in India, and we have them in the United States. So I'm just wondering if they have any background information somewhere.
I do not know that question. That would be an interesting one to reach out to and find out. I haven't found anything on the internet about it, to be honest, so I'm not sure.
So I'm going to chime in on that one and just say more than likely there's not, simply because Christians are a very small minority in India and oftentimes are persecuted because the dominant religion is Hinduism. Even the Muslims that are in India are persecuted in some capacity because it's not considered the culture. It's not considered a part of everywhere. They have gotten better about religious tolerance, but there is still some overarching division, I'll just say, in the cultures.
Well, I think there was some basis for the labeling of it as being a pessimist, from the perspective that he knew that if they go back to Jerusalem, and Bethany was really close to Jerusalem, there was a chance that they'd all be killed. And so as a pessimist, he just assumed that they'd be killed if they go to Jerusalem. Yet he went along with Jesus because obviously Jesus wasn't going to change his mind about going once he decided to go. So to me, that just brought up, why didn't they call him the brave Thomas, the one who was willing to die for the cause?
I agree with you, Jim, because I highlighted that because it says Thomas was an example of strength to the rest of the apostles. It appears they collectively followed his lead at this point and said, okay, let's go and die, because they did go with him to Bethany. So, Thomas, and to me, he was very courageous in that fact that, all right, Although you got to remember, I'm in quarantine right now, and I'm watching a lot of the Vikings. So, so I mean, when I read that, I was like, oh yeah, he's like, okay, let's get our sword and our shield, and let's go. Let's go get this done.
Well, and not just specifically Thomas, but looking at the Lazarus whole kind of incident on Jesus deciding to just wait. That every time I've read it originally, not in the book, but just the Bible, it's always that question of, okay, if Jesus loved them, why did he just twirl his thumbs as Lazarus died? This is the one that kind of made sense. Jesus knew that death was not final for him, that he could save Lazarus. And I think it was it's that point where I'm trying to remember what pastor it was, but they did a sermon on he stinketh, and it's in the Lazarus where he wasn't just dead; he was dead to the point that he was decomposing. And then it also kind of stood out for me that it mentions, or the book mentions, that Jesus had an attachment to Mary and Martha and to their family. And it kind of reminds me of how even just us, we kind of make attachments to certain family and friends and small groups, and it reaffirms that Jesus was human, and that he had that tendency of, this is a family that I love, and yeah, I'm going to go take care of Lazarus. I'm going to delay and let him decompose a little bit before bringing him back. It's just such a strange dichotomy.
Well, and the other reason why he waited was so it wasn't 3 days. He wanted to make sure that it was not 3 days, because that was the divine number that he would come back on. So he actually waited 4 days, so it became a miracle in him bringing somebody back, and not to confuse that Lazarus was the Messiah. Because that third day is an important number in the prophecy of the Messiah coming back. And actually, that was going to be kind of my next question, Scott, talking about the whole story. Hearing that story now within the book, and kind of the roundabout way of knowing the disciples now and everything, does it stick out anything in that story? Scott answered the fact that Jesus had connections in the earth, on earth, with other families, not just the 12. Did anything else kind of stick out to anybody?
They also talked about in that story that another reason why Jesus may have waited was because if he'd gone there right away and healed him, it was just Jesus healed another sick person. That was so it wouldn't be as effective as waiting until after he passed away and rose him from the dead.
So lastly, on this slide, and we'll move on to the next slide, I want to give a little bit of time at the end to talk about something else. But so he did go to India, and so his symbols are the spear, because all accounts say that he was stabbed, and that's how he was martyred, stabbed in the side, and the right angle. The right angle symbolizes the fact that he did build churches in India and in other locations, so he was considered the carpenter of the group, and actually physically went out and did it himself with the community to build churches. So I always thought that was kind of cool. Last slide. So we have Matthew down here and Thomas. So I put that Matthew was a
materialistic.
Thank you. I was like, I'm going to say that wrong right now, and I'm not going to go for it. But I said that he needed to learn forgiveness. And forgiveness on himself, first and foremost, that he did choose something that he probably regretted later in life, the career, but also forgiveness of people persecuting him, the Jews. and feeling alone. And so I did that for that one. And then the pessimistic Thomas, and that he needed to learn hope. The hope of Christ, not just the belief in him or the theoretical hope that can come. So that's what I put down as those two. Any thoughts on those?
I'll just point out that with Thomas, the pessimist and hope, it almost sounds depressed, or almost like depression to a certain extent. It's the, yeah, we're going to go die. Yeah, he's gone, going off by himself. And yet he found something to believe in beyond just himself and the world. So in a way, I could see where Thomas was also a little bit materialistic, or at least worldly, and he needed that divine hope.
And I'll just make the comment that the structure that you're building in the circle looks really interesting. Because
it's not unified.
Well, and part of it too is I think it's good because at the very center you have spiritual personalities and you have balance. And yet you have larger stones, you have smaller stones, and yet each one of them are going to be needed. And I think each one of these are bringing something that they needed to bring to the circle, to the group. Some of these too, they probably helped each other out to realize and say, yeah, you were just like me, or yeah, you need to learn this. And some of them probably did have their own little feuds of, like, as we've heard, who is the best among them. But they probably have a different take on this too, as they're on this journey together with Jesus.
No, very true. And Scott have kind of talked about this, and with Pastor at times too, of how learning was done in that day and age. Very, very different than the way we teach today. A Messiah or a teacher would share something, and then it was into the group. Then the group started discussing that, and then it became smaller groups discussed it, and then brought it back to the larger group to discuss, and then the teacher would just oversee that argument. So it would be very much of a conversational to learn something.
It sounds like we should maybe try doing some group projects here at the church.
Don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Eric, you kind of forgot off the final part of that teaching method, which was after they discussed, they would go back to the teacher, say, okay, here's what we think, and the teacher, no. You got this, here's the rest of it. And that's actually something we see in the Bible a lot, of Jesus teaching something, them coming up with their answer, and then Jesus reteaching it to fill in that gap that they probably didn't have.
Well, and it also goes back to why small groups is such an important factor, because we have this large group as a congregation and we're learning, and getting into smaller groups will help teach and grow us even stronger, because all these things that we're putting up here that people need to learn, like I can learn that from you, and I have, going through this process has been a great process for me, because I'm learning all these things again, and some that I just needed to learn for the first time. However, Pastor, I'm going to kind of hand it off to you, because we kind of talked about this last week, of having a conversation about what we want to do next, because we're about 2 weeks away. So go ahead, Pastor, kind of talking about next Bible study.
Okay. First thing, I'm going to stop recording.